we only had 3 people in here. All right, folks, welcome to Monday Morning AP Euro. Just to pick it up a little bit where we left off last time, talking about English Protestantism. So, we talked last time, I told you the whole story about how Catherine of Aragon, the Princess of Spain, goes and she's set to marry the older brother of the oldest son of Henry VII, Arthur, and she marries him. It doesn't last long. He dies. She ends up having to hang around until the younger brother, Henry VIII, Prince Henry, comes of age. She does marry him, but it does not last, and she was unable to conceive of a son. The daughter that they had was Mary. We talked about her a bit as well. Henry VIII was king, but while he was king, he was married to 6 different women. And I think I have, where is it? Right here. There's a portrait of every woman that Henry VIII was married to, and it's really thanks to the efforts of this guy, Thomas Cranmer, who replaced Wolsey after Wolsey dropped dead of a heart attack, and convinced Henry in 1533 that he could divorce Catherine of Aragon by breaking away from Rome, He gets later named the Archbishop of Canterbury of the Anglican Church. And Henry and Anne actually had secretly married in 1533. She was already 6 months pregnant with Elizabeth. Henry broke away from the Catholic Church, formed the Church of England, or also known as the Anglican Church, okay? And he passed something called the Act of Supremacy in 1534 that made the king the official head of the church. And then Catholic lands, which made up about 25% of lands in England, were all confiscated by the king, and this doubled royal revenues, which helped build up the military in England. Nobles, especially in the south, purchased large tracts of land. Some enclosures resulted. We'll talk more about what enclosures are another day. And the monasteries were torn down or closed down, and this resulted in what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was a multi-class rebellion in northern England, reacting both to the king closing down the monasteries as well as a number of other political and economic problems that the north of England was facing at the time. Also, Henry VIII passes the Act of Succession, which said that all the king's subjects had to take an oath of loyalty to the king as head of the Anglican Church. And Henry actually ended up ordering the execution of the humanist writer Thomas More for refusing to take that oath. And here you can see an image of Sir Robert Aske, who was the leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and a number of other nobles, and they were creating trouble in the north of England, and every one of these guys ends up ultimately getting executed. In 1539, Henry VIII passed the Statute of the Six Articles, which basically said that the Anglican Church maintained the most of all of the Protestant faiths. The Anglican Church remained the closest to Catholicism. Okay, even though it's independent from Rome, it's very, very similar. And it changed England forever and created a lot of numerous conflicts for decades to come. The only son that Henry VIII had was Edward VI, and Edward VI was 10 years old when he became king. His regents were strongly Protestant, and England became more Protestant during Edward VI's reign, but he does not reign for very long. And his premature death led to a religious struggle amongst Protestants and Catholics in England, because it's taken over at that point by Catholic Queen Mary I, sometimes nicknamed Bloody Mary, who tried unsuccessfully to reinstate Catholicism in England. She was the eldest daughter of Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Earlier, she had married Philip II, who was the future heir to the Spanish throne, in again an attempt to solidify an alliance between England and Spain. Mary rescinded Reformation legislation of Henry's and Edward's reign. Protestants fled England fearing persecution. They became known as the Marian exiles. And 300 people were executed, including bishops and Archbishop Cranmer, who had initially encouraged Henry to break away from the Roman Catholic Church in the first place. So she really does go a long way to try to execute a lot of Protestants at the top of the church, or at the top of government. Elizabeth I is who ends up succeeding Mary, and that's kind of where we left off last class. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, his second wife, and Catholics initially saw her as an illegitimate child and thus rejected her legitimacy regarding the throne. But she held strongly Protestant views like her mother, and that was probably a lot of the reason why these Catholics didn't really like her that much. But she effectively oversaw the development of Protestantism, the Anglican Church in England, for her entire rule. And as I mentioned last class, she became known as a politique. She was a practical and brilliant politician, really, really very, very, savvy. She had a lot of political acumen, and she carefully navigated a middle ground between Anglicanism and Protestant, and more radical Protestants as well as Catholics. Okay, other radical Protestants meaning like Calvinists, who start to emerge during her reign. So, and as a female monarch in a patriarchal system, that's a pretty notable accomplishment, because remember the prevailing attitudes towards women held by men in power at this time were not particularly good. And so the fact that she was able to keep stability and really navigate these murky waters in a time of religious conflict in Europe, a lot of credit needs to be given to Elizabeth I of England. The Puritans that start to come up during her time sought to reform the Anglican Church, which she had to mitigate because the Anglicans thought of the Puritans as religious extremists. And that's why Puritans in the early days of English colonization in North America left England, is because the Puritans were seen as radicals. They were seen as extremists, and the Anglicans didn't particularly like them. Even though the Anglicans were themselves Protestants, they were, remember, the Anglican Church was so similar to the Catholic Church that the Calvinists seemed, by comparison, just a bridge too far, a little bit too radical for the tastes of the Anglicans. She also is well known for something called the Elizabethan settlement. Queen Elizabeth and Parliament required conformity to the Church of England, but people were in effect allowed to worship Protestantism, like more radical Calvinists and Catholics were able to practice Catholicism in private. Okay, and so this is kind of it's not quite religious toleration per se. That she still required people on the outside to at least attend church at the Church of England and stuff like that, but behind closed doors, if they wanted to worship, under the Calvinist faith or the Catholic faith privately, they were more or less allowed to do that. The Anglican Church was very similar to Lutheranism. Like I said, both the Anglican Church and Lutheranism are really very close to Catholicism, even though they did break away. Some church practices, including ritual, resembled Catholic practices, and she also institutes the Book of Common Prayer by 1559, which, some of the other practices of the Anglican Church, were that clergy were allowed to marry, services were given in English rather than in Latin. But Catholicism does remain, especially amongst the gentry, but it just couldn't be practiced openly. You could only do it behind closed doors in the privacy of your own home. Everyone was required to attend church services of the Anglican Church, and you could be fined if you didn't show up. And also, the monasteries closed down by Henry VIII were never reopened. The other thing that Elizabeth does early on in her reign is something called the 39 Articles in 1563, which defined the creed of the Anglican Church. And it followed Protestant doctrine, but it was vague enough for most to accommodate most English people except for the radical Puritans. Some Catholics unsuccessfully plotted assassination attempts and invasions against Elizabeth. She had there was a particular story with that. She had a cousin, by the name of Mary Stuart. And Mary Stuart is a significant figure in the sense that her son ends up being the next king of England because Elizabeth never has any children. And the whole reason that the state or the colony originally of Virginia is named Virginia is because it's named after Elizabeth I, who got nicknamed the Virgin Queen because she never had any children. Now, she did have several relationships with various male members of her court, so it might not be the most truthful of titles that she got, this Virgin Queen title, but nonetheless, because she did not have any heirs, the next heir is going to go to somewhat of a distant relative, the son of her cousin. But the story about her cousin, Mary Stuart, also known as Mary, Queen of Scots, not to be confused with her older half-sister Mary, who by this point was already dead, her cousin, Mary Stuart, attempted to initiate a plot to remove Elizabeth from power and take the throne. And Elizabeth had a spy master known as Lord Walsingham. And Lord Walsingham discovered this plot and tricked Mary, Queen of Scots, and then betrayed Mary, Queen of Scots, because Walsingham was very, very loyal to Elizabeth I, and he was a Protestant, but he kind of pretended that he was converting to Catholicism, and then ended up convincing Mary Stuart that he was on her side, and then undermined her entire thing. So Elizabeth was very, very clever about how she went about holding on to her reign, and Mary Stuart ends up being executed by Elizabeth. So Elizabeth orders the execution of her first cousin, and while she didn't really know her first cousin at all, it's not like they were childhood friends or anything like that. The story goes that they really never even met before her execution. Mary Stuart, it was really, the whole execution was a giantly bungled. The whole thing really went very badly. Basically what happens is, the way that executions took place, you had an executioner with basically a large axe, and it turns into a bloodbath. The first axe strike does not cleanly hit her neck, and so it doesn't decapitate her at first. He ends up having to swing 3 times to remove her head. It's the whole thing is just a giant debacle. It's really bad, and Elizabeth basically runs out screaming because she was already a little uncomfortable about this, but then the whole thing goes down so badly. Also, another thing that was really sad was that, she had, unbeknownst to other people, she was wearing kind of like a gown to be taken out to her execution. She had hidden her little dog to bring her comfort during her execution. So she gets massacred during this execution. Then the dog, scampers out from her clothes, and it's just, the whole thing was just sad and very disturbing, and it really upset Elizabeth, actually. But nonetheless, Elizabeth's long and successful reign really placed her amongst the greatest of European rulers in all of this class. She really was very, very adept as the ruler of England. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the impact of the Reformation on women. You might think that because the Protestant Reformation is making some changes and so on, and you have like a spirit equality of believers, in the sense spiritually equal, that both men and women have an equal chance of getting into heaven and stuff. The fact of the matter is that, to be honest with you, the Protestant Reformation isn't as forward moving for women as you might think that it would be. Luther believed that a woman's occupation was in the home, taking care of the family, and that really supports very conservative traditional beliefs about the role of women in society. John Calvin, also believed in the subjugation of women to preserve the moral order. And two, remember that Protestant churches generally had greater official control over marriage than the Catholic Church did. So, for example, they suppressed common law marriages, which had been very common in Catholic countries, meaning that a person may not have actually formally been married in the church, but were recognized through common law marriage. If they had been living together for a while and raised a family, it was known as a common law marriage, and that they would officially be recognized legally as married, even though they didn't technically get married within the church. That kind of goes out the window with Protestantism, and Catholic governments followed the Protestant example afterwards. Protestant women also, marriage became more companionate, we'll say, emphasizing the loving relationship between man and wife rather than being purely economical or arranged. Martin Luther and his wife Katharina von Bora were good examples of this view. In the Lutheran Church, sex was to be enjoyed as a loving act between a husband and wife, not just an act of procreation, which was the official viewpoint of the Roman Catholic Church. And there was an increased emphasis on teaching people how to read the Bible, which of course does increase to women, result in an increase in women's literacy. So, but then too, literacy of everyone. Mothers, though, were then expected to teach their children the Bible, teach their kids how to read. There were some schools for girls that were developed in the Protestant faith. But I wouldn't necessarily say that on a grand scheme that the position of women was particularly advanced by the Protestant Reformation, despite some of these small steps forward in terms of a social order of things. Women were still expected to be in a subordinate role to men within society. And so Protestant women lost opportunities in the church service that many Catholic women pursued, for example, becoming nuns and stuff like that. And really, women under Protestantism gradually kind of lost rights to manage their own property or to make legal transactions in their own name. Unlike today, where divorce proceedings can move forward if a woman is unhappy in her marriage, she can divorce her husband. A lot of times, the law favors women in terms of taking custody of children and stuff like that. None of those were practices that were commonplace in these times. As a woman, it would have been very difficult to secure a divorce against your husband. The men had all of the upper hand in laws, and then too, just understanding that the role of women was really to be a good housewife, and that's not a very we wouldn't call that a very progressive viewpoint. Despite the fact that women are, to some extent, becoming more educated in terms of their literacy, particularly pertaining to the Bible and stuff. Again, the idea being that women should play this particular role within the family and within society at large. Catholic women continued to enjoy opportunities in the church through religious orders, and we do see in the Counter-Reformation a handful of women who play significant role in the Counter-Reformation. Remember, the Catholic Church isn't just willfully allowing Protestantism to spread. They're doing their best to try to contain the control of the spread of Protestantism. And you have Angela Merici, who founded the Ursuline Order of the Nuns in the 1530s, shortly after the start of the Protestant Reformation, to provide education and religious training to nuns who were, in the process of becoming nuns or had already become nuns. She was approved as, the Ursuline Order of Nuns was approved as a religious community by Pope Paul III in 1544. And she sought to combat heresy through Christian education. And eventually the Ursuline Order of Nuns even spread to France and the New World. Another major female figure of the Catholic Church was Teresa de Avila. She was a major Spanish leader of the Reform movement for monasteries and convents, and she preached that an individual could have a direct relationship with God and through prayer and contemplation. So there are some significant women who play a role in the Counter-Reformation. The defenestration of Prague. Remember that one of the big takeaways from the Protestant Reformation. Now, look at the year here. We're already 100 years ahead of where Luther first broke away from the Catholic Church and established Lutheranism. So even a century later, we're still seeing religious warfare in Europe. So there's a number of religious wars that particularly increasingly take place not only between Catholics and Protestants, but between different orders of Protestantism, where Calvinists in particular were seen as these religious fanatics, as I mentioned a few minutes ago when we were talking about Elizabeth I. Puritans in England were known as being the most radical of the Protestants, and more moderate Protestants like the Anglican. Okay, sorry, I think I might have lost my connection there for a second, but hopefully we're back now. The point that I'm trying to make here is that religious wars are continuing even a century after the original break from the church by Martin Luther. And the last major religious war in Europe that's fought is called the 30 Years' War. Now, this chapter doesn't talk a ton about the 30 Years' War, but we're going to just kind of give you the introduction to it, and we'll probably finish up by talking about the 30 Years' War on a different day, maybe not even within this unit, but nonetheless, the way that this whole thing gets started is actually in Prague, which is in modern-day Czech Republic. And Prague at this time was still in the state of Bohemia, which at the time was a part of the Holy Roman Empire. And so when we talk about the start of the 30 Years' War, it actually starts in Central Europe, okay, pretty much smack dab in the center of Europe in Prague. And so May 23rd, 1618, protesters carried a petition, which is a document with a bunch of signatures on it, to Prague's Hradčany Palace, stormed into the council chamber and engaged the Catholic officials in a debate. And these Protestants, these protesters, end up taking and throwing two royal delegates, Catholic royal delegates, out the window. And the crowd below, because we had seen rising Protestantism in Prague, the crowd below was angry that there was no one killed. And depending on who you talked to, if you asked Catholics and asked them, how come, these two guys who got thrown out the window, which is what defenestration means, to literally throw someone out a window is to defenestrate them, okay? And so they literally throw these guys out a window, but they don't die. Catholics say angels swoop down to save them, okay? And then Protestants say that the men fell, the only reason they didn't die is because they fell on giant heaps of horse dung. And so it depends on the story. The story that you get depends on who you ask. But nonetheless, this is the thing, the act that first initiates this last religious war known as the 30 Years' War. And we'll talk about the 30 Years' War more in detail another day, as I said. But I just wanted to put this in your head that this is going to be the last of the major religious wars, and it lasts for 30 years. So if you do the math there, it starts in 1618, it ends in 1648. The Reformation had left much of Europe kind of randomly divided by their religious allegiances, and much of Germany was at peace for a while, but not really France. And so we're actually going to, rather than talking about the 30 Years' War right now, I'm just going to switch topics a little bit and talk about the French wars of religion, okay, which had started a little bit earlier. But basically, the French wars of religion and the 30 Years' War both began because of these religious disagreements, Catholics versus Protestants, in particular the Calvinists. All right, and you have these dynastic ambitions. So not all of these religious wars are going to be solely rooted in religion. It has everything to do with religion, but it also has to do with who's going to rule the state. And you have the Catholic Bourbons in France, and you have the Catholic Habsburgs in Austria, and both of them want to retain their dynastic holdings. They don't want to lose their positions as being the head of state. So we can say that there are political motivations in these wars as well, in terms of who's going to rule, and dependent on who's going to rule, the faith of the location could change. Now, Calvinism had been spreading quite quickly in France, and we call French Calvinists Huguenots. Okay, French Calvinists are known as Huguenots. Now, Francis I of France was in what was known as the Valois dynasty. Okay, the Valois dynasty. And Francis I of France was king of France at about the same time that Henry VIII is king of England, okay? In fact, they actually knew one another. Henry VIII one time had a wrestling competition with Francis I, which he lost. He went down to France, and there was this giant kind of Renaissance-type festival, and Henry VIII challenged Francis I of France to a wrestling match, but then lost. And he sulked about it for the rest of the week. He tried to centralize his power. Francis I of France tried to centralize his power by taking away some nobles' judicial abilities, insisting on his authority to assess and collect taxes, reducing the Catholic Church's authority through the Concordat of Bologna in 1516, which established royal control over clergy appointments, selling offices to nobles in exchange for their loyalty. Okay, so he is centralizing his power at this time in France by trying to whittle away at the Catholic Church's authority while at the same time retaining the Catholic faith in France. Nobles resisted this, though, and meanwhile, Calvinism is spreading significantly in France, and the peasants start getting squeezed pretty hard for taxes. Francis I dies in 1547 and is succeeded by his son Henry, this time Henry II, because we're in a different place, right? Henry VIII of England. We're now in France, so it's Henry II of France in 1547. Henry II also attempted to repress the Huguenots. He even created martyrs out of this because, people are dying for their faith. And so we start to see, Huguenot, devout Huguenots who are being praised for dying in the name of their faith by the Catholic King Henry II. And he had to really drop the long war against Spain by signing something called the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559. And this treaty meant that France agreed to respect Habsburg primacy and Italy and control over Flanders. Why did they do this? Well, partly due to running out of resources, but also because both were Catholic and concerned about the rapid spread of Calvinism going on at this time. So they kind of, due to religious purposes, decided to put their wars aside and protect the faith. But Henry II of France ends up entering into a jousting tournament, and he ends up getting killed by a lance. He gets knocked off his horse and essentially skewered by a lance, and he dies. And so Henry II of France dies in an unfortunate jousting accident. Afterwards, he does have a son, but the son was too old or too young rather, to take over the throne. And so the regent, the regent of the heir to the throne and the regent is just somebody who handles affairs until the king comes of age, the new king comes of age. And the regent in this case was the widow of Henry VIII, and her name was Catherine de' Medici, which of course means that she's related to the old banking family of the Medicis in Italy. And they sometimes called Catherine de' Medici the shopkeeper's daughter. They didn't really like her in France. She was seen as a foreigner. She was seen as meddling in people's affairs and stuff like that. But she is the widow of Henry II, and she is the one who ends up, basically dominating the rule of her three sickly and rather incompetent sons. And at this time, due to the fact that she's kind of pulling all the strings here and her sons are not very competent as rulers, you end up having three different powerful noble families who start to challenge the throne, challenge the regency of Catherine de' Medici after Henry II gets killed in this jousting accident. And so these three powerful noble families were the Catholic Guise family, the Catholic Guise family, the Catholic Montmorency family, and the Huguenot Bourbon family. Now, the reason that the Bourbon family is Huguenot is because the main character in the Bourbon family is going to be a guy named Henry of Navarre. And really what we're setting up here is something called the War of the Three Henrys, which is kind of a complicated story in history. All right, so I'm going to try and explain this to you the best that I can. Essentially, you have three different Henrys who are vying for power right now to become King of France. And Henry of Navarre is from the Bourbon family. Henry of Navarre was Huguenot, but he's not a super passionate Huguenot. He vacillates. He goes back and forth between Calvinism, Huguenot, and Catholicism. So he kind of bounces back and forth, and he's not super radical in his beliefs. He's got other, things that he prioritizes over his faith. In 1560, Louis, the Prince of Conde, was a Bourbon family member, and he had originally planned to kidnap Francis II, who was the son of Catherine de' Medici. But the Guise family found out about this, killed the Bourbon conspirators, and this rivalry weakened the monarch's power in the long run. Another guy that we need to know about is Francis, Duke of Guise, and in 1562 he ordered the execution of Huguenots worshiping on his land, and more than 3,000 Huguenots were killed in this fight. So again, religious wars in France. Protestant bodies were tossed into a river, and their neighborhoods were burned to purify them. And this really began the first full-scale religious war in France between Calvinists and Catholics. Huguenots, that is. Huguenots are Calvinists. And he ends up getting assassinated by a Huguenot in 1563. Now, King Francis II, the guy that they had originally been planning to kidnap, dies with no heir, and now his younger brother, Charles IX, took over the throne, but neither he or his younger brothers have sons, and this leaves a lot of doubt in the Valois dynasty that had been in charge of France for some time by this point. And so it's, the fact that they don't have sons means that there's a lot of questions surrounding the future of the French dynasty. So Charles IX of France was a Catholic, and in 1572, he agreed to provide support to the Dutch Protestants who were fighting against France's rival Spain, who controlled the Low Countries at the time. And the Low Countries are going to be, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. Those are the Low Countries, and they're situated they border France, so just to the east of northeast France. Okay, and Charles IX is pressured by both family and the Pope, and he renounced that support for the Dutch, and he accepted direction from the Catholic House of Guise. Okay, and the Guise family tried and failed to assassinate this Calvinist Protestant leader named Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, who was part of the Montmorency family, which was Catholic, but he had converted to Protestantism. So they tried and failed to assassinate this Protestant Huguenot leader, Gaspard de Coligny, who had converted to Catholicism. And his Charles IX's sister, Margaret, ended up marrying that guy Henry of Navarre, who I was telling you about, who was himself a Huguenot, and Charles IX died in 1574. So France is having some dynastic problems in the late 1500s, and a lot of tension surrounding religious pluralism in France. One of the things that happens while Charles IX is still alive, before his sister gets married, remember, she's Catholic, she's marrying Henry of Navarre, who's a Huguenot, okay? And this is about as close, if you've ever seen the old mob movie known as The Godfather, it's kind of similar to that. It's really quite a story. This is known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And what ended up happening is, before his sister got married to Henry of Navarre, Charles IX gets influenced by his mother, who had also been his regent years back, named Catherine de' Medici, who the French people didn't like. Remember, she's like a devout Catholic. Also, the Guise family is very devoutly Catholic, and there were advisors there that were also convincing Charles IX, who was highly, persuaded by people in his ear, to strike brutally against the Huguenots at this wedding. And so, basically, we have this royal marriage that's about to take place between the king's sister and this other noble, Henry of Navarre. And on August 24th, in the early morning, Catholic assassins show up to this thing and murder Huguenot leaders, including Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, who we talked about a minute ago. And for 6 days, Catholic mobs are storming the streets, killing 2,000 Calvinists, Protestants, outside of Paris. Another 10,000 died. And so we call this a massacre because, it really does result in over 10,000 deaths of Huguenot worshipers, some of which who held relatively significant positions within the French nobility. And so this is an artistic rendition of this massacre that took place on the day of this wedding. The next king of France is a guy named Henry III, and this is where we start to enter into the War of the Three Henrys. So, Henry III of France was a small, kind of frail man. When they coronate him, the crown slipped off his head twice at coronation, which doesn't look good because your head's too small to even fit the crown. On the surface, he seemed devoutly religious, but enjoyed dressing as a woman, and also enjoyed the company of young male courtiers. Just in a time where France is already rife with religious conflict at this time, rife with dynastical incompetence, To have this gentleman come to the throne at this time in the late 1500s is, again, not going to look good for the future of the French state. And on top of that, really reckless with money, attempted to raise taxes, gets rejected by the nobility, who really resent him, and they look at him as a weak king. And so politiques, who were moderate Catholics who wanted to end the bloodshed by signing agreements with Huguenots, end up kind of being persuasive at this time. And radical Catholics are angry that Henry kind of gets influenced by these moderate Catholic politiques, okay, by signing this agreement with Huguenots. And so we see more radical Catholics create something known as the Catholic League, which begins to threaten the monarchy of Henry III of France. And so this is where we see the struggle of the three Henrys. So you've got three Henrys that are major players in these wars that are going to be popping up in France, starting here in the late 1570s, early 1580s. Basically, Henry III, Henry, Duke of Guise, he's from that Catholic Guise family, and then Henry of Navarre, who's from the Bourbon family, okay? And he is married, remember, to that sister of Henry II, okay? Henry III and Charles IX, okay? So, and he is technically heir to the kingdom of France, okay? So Henry of Navarre comes in with a strong position because he is married to the Catholic older sister, despite the fact that he himself is a Huguenot. Now, at first, Henry III and Henry of Navarre were against the Catholic Henry, Duke of Guise. But then Henry III, because he's influenced by more religiously devout Catholics, he switches sides. And Henry of Navarre basically made a very politique-type statement. Remember what a politique is. It's a person who's able to deftly navigate kind of these murky waters of Catholicism versus Protestantism and kind of sit on a middle ground there and not come out too hardcore on either side, all right? And so Henry of Navarre makes this statement calling on all true French soldiers, regardless of their religion, to rally. And in 1587, Henry of Navarre ends up defeating the king and the Catholic League, but he actually at that time decides not to take the throne, in particular because he had some other women that he had on the side that he was interested in and stuff like that. But eventually, Henry IV does end up subduing both the Henry, Duke of Guise, and Henry III, who was the House of Valois and Catholic. And Henry of Navarre does become Henry IV of France. And Henry IV is known as Henry the Good King, okay? Henry the Good King of France. And in 1588, Spain had been fighting England as a product of something called the Spanish Armada. And that came about as a product of Elizabeth, who had been basically kind of hiring privateers, which are essentially state-sanctioned pirates, especially one by the name of, what's his name? Oh, man, I'm blanking on his name now. As soon as I see it, I'll remember it. Elizabeth privateer. Francis Drake. Okay, sorry. All right, I had to look it up. But yeah, Francis Drake is this basically state-sanctioned pirate who Elizabeth is paying to go and steal from Spanish ships. And the King of Spain at this time finds out about this. Philip II finds out about this and initiates the Spanish Armada. And so the Spanish Armada that's every single ship basically that would float. They send them up to England, but with the money that Elizabeth had been using, or had been stealing from the Spanish, she ends up using it to build a formidable naval force known as the English Royal Navy. And so when the Spanish show up in late 1500s after the English had been stealing silver and other things from them for the last 30 or 40 years, she has quite a defense force, and the Spanish Armada is absolutely decimated by the English ships. Believe it or not, the Spanish actually had larger ships, but the English had smaller and better built ships that were more maneuverable and also faster. And so they were able to break up the Spanish Armada, which, by the way, arrived after a giant storm in the Bay of Biscay, which is just north of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And so by the time that they even arrive in England, their forces have already been decimated by this storm, and then they run into this brand new English Royal Navy that further continues to decimate them. And so in 1588, Spain is defeated by the English in the Spanish Armada, and they no longer back Henry the Duke of Guise, who gets assassinated by Henry III's bodyguards in 1588. And this revived the Catholic League revolts against Henry III. And basically, by this point, Henry III had no choice but to ally with Henry of Navarre. But ultimately, a monk, Catholic monk, ends up assassinating Henry III of the Valois dynasty in 1589. His bodyguards then turn to Henry of Navarre and swear their allegiance to him. And then Henry of Navarre, who was, remember, a Huguenot, ends up defeating the Catholic League in 1589 and 1590. And in order to become King of France, all right, he essentially is forced to renounce his Protestant Huguenot faith and convert to Catholicism. And in 1593, he converts to Catholicism and becomes King of France. And so that's kind of the tail end of the War of the Three Henrys and how Henry of Navarre ultimately became King of France. So lots and lots of religious warfare in France in the 1560s, 70s, and into the 1580s. And Henry of Navarre, which is now initiates a new dynasty called the Bourbon dynasty, which will be Catholic because, remember, Henry IV converts to Catholicism. They're going to be probably a little bit more moderate Catholics, though, at least at first. And eventually down the line, they become stronger Catholics under, say, Louis XIII and Louis XIV, who are also of the Bourbon dynasty later on next century. But one of the famous quotes that Henry of Navarre says is, basically something to the effect of, France is worth a mass, or something like that. Something to the effect of like, if all it takes to be the King of France is converting to Catholicism and going to Catholic Mass, France is worth a mass. Okay, meaning that, look, I'll go to Catholic Church and I'll become Catholic if it means the security of France, okay, and establishing a new dynasty. So Henry IV, a.k.a. Henry of Navarre of France, but the Bourbon dynasty, 1596, he convinced an assembly of notables to approve an additional tax called the Paulette, which ensured office holders that their title would be passed on to an heir via annual payment. In 1598, the most significant thing that Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, does is he signs something called the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes was an attempt to put an end to all of this religious pluralism and the religious wars of France, where he makes Catholicism the official religion of France, but also at the same time granted 2 million Protestants, which was a significant minority of a population of about 18.5 million in France at the time, the right to worship at home, hold their own religious services, and have schools even in some places. So this is trying to basically, it's an act of religious toleration. It's saying, look, the official religion of France is going to stay Catholicism, all right? However, we're going to go ahead and grant toleration to the Huguenots so that they don't have to worry about being slaughtered just based on the basis of their religion. Henry IV is not well liked by a bunch of more radical Catholics. He actually survives 9 assassination attempts, but they were constantly making attempts on Henry IV's life. And he is able to outwit a number of them, but ultimately does end up dying at the hands of an assassin. But we'll talk about that. He's king for about 20 years, though, before he is assassinated. And good King Henry, or Henry IV, the good king of France, made the French monarchy more powerful by dispensing privileges, favors, and money, and earning people's loyalty, and using a royal privy council, kind of similar to the way that Henry VII of England created the Court of Star Chamber, which was another of those privy councils, which is, you've got certain counselors who are in the king's inner circle that make good decisions and stuff that the king consults with. Much of his centralizing success came thanks to his Minister of Finance, which was a guy named Maximilien de Bethune, sometimes known as the Duke of Sully, who was very adamant about keeping budgets, bookkeeping. He kept the economy and the finances of France very efficient while Henry IV was king. So he's surrounding himself with good ministers who are going to be able to handle the state affairs and operate in the inner circle of the king. He also encouraged manufacturing silk and tapestries. He invested in canal construction to increase trade throughout France, which, France was notoriously stifled by all sorts of tolls and tariffs because France had kind of a situation where your distantly located nobles in southern France and far western France really did have a lot of autonomy. French trade was notoriously inefficient and expensive to trade across their own kingdom. And so he's trying to kind of break down some of these economic barriers to increase trade. But in 1610, he gets stuck in a traffic jam in Paris. And remember, they don't have cars, it's horse and carriages at this time. But he gets stuck because the streets of Paris in the 1600s were still very medieval in nature. They were very, very narrow corridors. The buildings were built very closely together. And a monk breaks into the king's carriage, stabs him 3 times, and kills him. And so he's stuck in this traffic jam. There was nowhere for him to really escape. And this assassin takes this opportunity and ends up killing Henry IV. He is succeeded by Louis XIII. Okay, Louis XIII was only 8 years old when he was crowned, but he's known for being stubborn and high-strung. He was beaten mercilessly as a child, and he comes to the throne with really a very vindictive, vengeful type personality. He ends up marrying an Austrian princess, but it's an unhappy marriage. They're not very happy with one another, and they do produce an heir in 1638. And while Louis XIII was very, very intelligent, he was also brutal and very prone to rage. He's kind of on a hair trigger at all times, and he actually ends up ordering more executions than any other French monarch in history. And a lot of the reason that we credit Louis XIII with having a somewhat successful, albeit brutal, reign is because of this guy who works under the king as one of these counselors within his inner circle, and this guy's name was Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu expanded the administrative authority and fiscal reach of the crown and increased taxes substantially. All right, Cardinal Richelieu is another one of these guys who, yes, he's a cardinal, yes, he's part of the clergy, but he's again using politique to service the King of France, okay, navigate those middle waters to approach foreign and domestic affairs, and really perfected his own political survival. And so the teachings of Cardinal Richelieu get passed down to other high-ranking noble figures within the French state who serve the king within that privy council. And that's a three-pose portrait of Cardinal Richelieu. One of the things that Cardinal Richelieu does is he starts using intendants. Intendants were officials who were overseen by the king's council and responsible to the king. And what this does, when you hire intendants, it's a really smart thing to do. You're creating what's known as a bureaucracy. All right, and a bureaucracy is all of these people who are hired by the king but may not actually necessarily be actual nobles. They're coming from middling positions in society. And the reason that this is really smart is because you can hire and fire these people without having them dispute the fact, because they're only in their position but for the grace of the king. Okay, and so they really they don't have the level of leverage that a noble would by way of birthright. And so hiring these intendants, these officials who are in royal capacities hired by the king, but can also be fired by the king. It's a really smart thing to do because, excuse me, these intendants want to keep their job. They want to stay in the good graces of the king. They want to work hard for the king. They want to improve their own position within the order of things in France, the social and political order. They want to improve their position, so they're going to be very loyal and work very hard. Meanwhile, the king knows that if they don't work hard or if they end up screwing up, that they can be very easily dispensed of without having any opposition to that firing. And so these intendants increasingly become very important to the functioning of the state and centralizing of the king's power, because these intendants hired by the king go to nobles as middlemen and are forced to collect taxes from them and stuff like that. And this very much centralizes his authority. So with Richelieu's help, Louis XIII established the beginnings of absolutism in France, which then get perfected by the heir to Louis XIII, who is Louis XIV. And so, and he actually, ends up reversing his mother's pro-Spain policy and opposing the Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War, despite the fact that the Habsburgs were Catholic and so were France. The French are doing everything that they can to increase their state authority, centralize the power of the monarchy during this time. And Louis XIII ends up dying of tuberculosis in 1643 at the age of 42. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's lecture. The next thing is the 30 Years' War. But we will sit on the 30 Years' War for right now because there's other things that we have to talk about before the end of this unit. But I will be posting an assignment here in the next probably 5 minutes or so, and you can use the remainder of the class time today, which is really not that much time, about a half hour, to get going on that. Remember, at the end of this week, we do have a test on the Protestant Reformation. That's on Friday, and that's so a Unit 2 test. There will be some online quizzes that go along with that. That I will be posting shortly here, and that'll be part of your assignment for both today and for on Wednesday to prepare you for the exam. So some of these assignments that you're going to get today are going to go back and review some of the earlier stuff that we talked about in this unit, and then as we get to Wednesday, some of the more recent stuff that we talked about. And on Wednesday, we'll finish up by doing a lecture and doing some review of some things, and then by Friday, we'll be ready to take the test. So, which will again be offered just as it was last time on Canvas. So, and if I've said Schoology at all, I apologize. I sometimes do that by habit because I used to use Schoology. But anytime that I've said that, I hope you understand that I'm referring to Canvas. But anyway, so Canvas, I'll be posting this stuff to Canvas shortly, and the test on Friday will be on Canvas as well. So, I'll be putting all this stuff up in just a few minutes here. And do start to work on that and get those things done. Also, I continue to update grades. If you saw my post on Canvas last Thursday, I put a post on Canvas talking about updating grades. And if you reply to that post and let me know if there's anything that you're missing, I'll make sure to go back and review those things. A couple of you did respond to that. And so I'll make sure to go back and have the grades updated. I've really been pretty good about staying on top of grades and making sure that I'm updating it a couple times a week and stuff like that. So please, if you want me to make sure that I don't forget to add something, just go on Canvas, go to the announcements section, and reply to the post that I put up about things, because otherwise receiving a million messages all over the place, email, Canvas messaging, it's made it really, really hard to track late work. And because they're handing in things late. I teach 8 different classes, folks. It's a nightmare organizationally to have to take care of late work. So if we can try and make this process a little bit more seamless on my side, where it's clear to me something's missing by you responding to this post, then that'll make it easier for me to navigate and make sure that I get things taken care of on my end. So anyhow, please do that. If you have any questions about today. Also feel free to shoot me a message on Canvas and I can get back to you. In terms of attendance, here's how I'd like to handle attendance for today, because it makes it just easier for me. If you could just log on to Canvas today. Okay, that way, because it tells me, it timestamps every time that you log into Canvas for me. So I can tell who's logging into Canvas. I can tell how much time you've spent on Canvas, those kinds of things. But do log into Canvas, when we have days that we have class, and I can use that to take attendance of who has been watching the online lectures. All right, folks, that does it for me today. I'm going to get going on posting this stuff on Canvas and hopefully give you a little bit of time to get that done. If you don't have time to finish it by the time that your next class starts, then just make sure that you come back in the afternoon and get it done for Wednesday. All right, folks, have a great day, and we'll see you back here Wednesday morning.